Steve, you've built your own philosophical gallows and are now congratulating yourself for discovering the rope. You're sitting there bragging about how the consent argument fails because there's no pre-existent being to give consent before conception. Do you even hear yourself? You've just described why procreation is unethical and then mistaken it for a rebuttal. The entire point of the consent argument is that the absence of a consenting agent doesn't nullify the problem. It creates it. The act of birth manufactures a subject of harm without prior approval, and you think you've outsmarted ethics by noticing the chronological order. That's like saying it's fine to set a trap in an empty field because no one stepped in it yet. The victim shows up later, Steve. That's what makes it a trap. You're confusing time with justification and calling it philosophy. You treat ethics like a bureaucratic form. No signature, no foul. But morality doesn't wait for paperwork. It's about imposition. If your logic were consistent, any harm aimed at future persons would be ethically neutral because they don't yet exist to object. Pollute the oceans, detonate long-term radiation, rewrite genomes, it's all fine under Steve's law of temporal loopholes. The moment your reasoning gets applied beyond procreation, it disintegrates. If you can't stomach those consequences, you've already admitted your framework is broken. Then you stumble into the mere fact of suffering isn't enough line. That's a hollow truism meant to sound profound. Of course, the mere fact isn't enough. It's the inevitability and non-consensual imposition that matter. Life doesn't offer the option to opt out before the pain starts. It drafts you first and hands you the consequences later. You can't brush that aside by calling it epistemically uncertain. That's just you hiding from the obvious behind a wall of syllables. And this whole melodrama about certainty dulls critical thinking? No, Steve, certainty doesn't dull thought. Laziness does. You were never certain, you just parroted the arguments you half understood until doubt felt fashionable again. Now you're mistaking your loss of confidence for intellectual growth. Skepticism is valuable when it sharpens precision, not when it excuses retreat. You're not Socrates discovering ignorance. You're a man backpedaling from his own conclusions because they made dinner conversations uncomfortable. Let's corner you properly. If consent can't apply because there's no one to give it, then your reasoning commits you to moral silence about every action that affects the unborn. That means you can't condemn policies that guarantee suffering for future generations, can't object to climate collapse, can't judge any decision whose victims don't exist yet. The logical endpoint of your position is ethical nihilism. Either you accept that grotesque implication, or you concede that the interests of future persons do carry moral weight, and that consent arguments, while necessarily indirect, are valid tools for discussing those interests. Pick one. You don't get to float in the middle pretending uncertainty is insight. What you call a revelation is just you discovering the boundaries of your own comprehension. You think pointing out that unborn people don't exist yet is some devastating counter-argument. It's the moral premise of antinatalism. The harm is not failing to obtain consent. It's acting in the absence of it when the outcome is inevitably harmful. That's the ethical heart you've failed to touch because you've spent years treating philosophy like a word game instead of a confrontation with reality. You talk about dukkha as though you grasp it, but your reasoning shows you don't. Dukkha is the unavoidable suffering embedded in existence itself. The exact reason non-consensual creation is indefensible. You can't separate the two concepts. They're welded together. By claiming you can't determine the ethics either way, you've converted ethics into a parlor trick. You want to keep the illusion of sophistication while discarding the responsibility that comes with understanding. Here's the truth you keep dodging. Procreation is an act of unilateral risk imposition. It's not complex. You're gambling with someone else's pain threshold, future traumas, and mortality odds without their assent. You can't hide that behind metaphysical smoke or clever disclaimers about uncertainty. If uncertainty truly paralyzed ethics, we'd have no reason to forbid anything ever. We forbid harm because we can see it coming, not because we've charted every metaphysical contour of consent. So drop the pretense. You didn't outgrow antinatalism. You ducked it. You wanted relief from its implications, and now you're dressing that relief up as enlightenment. You've replaced moral courage with intellectual theater. You're not advancing the discourse. You're stalling it. because your ego can't handle the simplicity of the conclusion. If the absence of a consenting agent invalidates ethics, you've erased morality itself. If it doesn't, then you're wrong. There's no middle. Either grow a spine and accept that logic has consequences, or stop pretending you ever understood what ethics was for.